Welcome to God and Country Biblical Exposition. The topic for today's program is how to talk politics, the art of political communication. There needs to be a YouTube on the subject, permanent resource to direct some family and friends to. All of us have that family member or that coworker who ruins the party by going off into a political rant. He sucks the oxygen out of the room. Everybody starts to leave the room, avoid him, and he's clueless as to why people are walking away from him. We feel sorry for him. We wish we could find some way to tactfully correct him. But one thing's for sure, we certainly don't want to be stuck in a conversation with him. In fact, we might agree with much of what he has to say, but the problem is how he says it. He ruins good positions, and you feel like you don't even want to take those positions because of the people who represent those positions. Sure, you'd like to see a wall built. I mean, there ought to be border protection. That's just common sense. But the way this guy advocates for it is appalling. The condescending tone in his voice, the negativity, the anger in his countenance. It turns people off, and it turns you off. So who do we call these people? Political hotheads? Red meat political hotheads, political junkies, political wonks, whatever. All you know is you don't want to be one. And after hearing these people, you hope to God that you do not sound that way. So the subject for today's program is how to talk politics, because it's a learned skill. It's not something that we're born with. The Bible instructs Christians in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 15, to speak the truth in love. We are to grow up in all aspects into Him who is the head, even Christ. So that verse alone reminds us that being a good conversationalist is a matter of Christian growth. I see this as a two-stage process. We take the first 10 years of our Christian life learning the truth, the Christian doctrine, the text of Scripture, the application of Christian doctrine to business, to family, to psychology, to politics. And that alone takes a PhD in the school of life. But then comes the next stage, learning how to communicate those truths in love. And this can be just as difficult as the first stage, trying to learn how to best communicate truth. And this seems to be a step that's overlooked by many people. Because I see many Christians getting past that first stage. They know the doctrine. Their heads are filled with knowledge, but they never seem to get on to that second stage. They know the truth, but they don't know how to communicate it. And that's 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Verse 1, knowledge alone makes arrogant, but love builds up. And verse 2, you know, but you don't know as you ought to know. Often our love lags behind our knowledge, and it takes a few years for our love to get caught up with our knowledge. So let me just mention a few scriptures about the importance of right communication to get us started here. Ecclesiastes chapter 12. In addition to being a wise man, in addition to being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, and he pondered, searched out, and arranged many proverbs. The preacher sought to find delightful words and to write words of truth correctly. Proverbs 15:23, a man has joy by an apt answer, and how delightful is a timely word. Proverbs 16:21, the wise in heart will be called understanding, and sweetness of speech increases persuasiveness. Proverbs 16:23, the heart of the wise instructs his mouth, and adds persuasiveness to his lips. Proverbs 25:11, like apples of gold in settings of silver, is a word spoken in right circumstances. 1 Peter 3:15, but sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is within you, with gentleness and reverence. Colossians 4:5, conduct yourself with wisdom toward outsiders, making the most of your opportunity. Let your speech be always with grace, as though seasoned with salt, so that you will know how you should respond to each person. So the Bible itself, in the Proverbs, in the example of Jesus, in the apostolic letters, gives us many do's and don'ts in regard to our communication, just like the Bible gives us many do's and don'ts in regard to our moral behavior. The Proverbs are written to give prudence to the naive and to the youth knowledge and discretion. I mean, it's great if your parents gave you a head start by modeling for you good conversation, but if not, you're going to have to learn the hard way. Poring over the Bible and making a list of the principles regarding conversation, and then practice. It takes time to develop communication skills, but you're never going to develop that skill if you don't start off realizing that it is a skill that needs to be developed. It means going away from a conversation, admitting to oneself, well, that didn't seem to go very well. I said too much. I said too little. I wasn't clear. I don't think I got the point across. And we've all had that experience. Hindsight is 20/20. Afterwards, we all think of the great things we should have said. But in the heat of the battle, we just blabbered at the mouth. But if we practice, we can improve our conversation in those moments. Every conversation should be viewed as practice for the next conversation. And we need to be definite about this. We need to leave each conversation planning to make the next one better. Planning better icebreakers, better thought-provoking questions, better concise statements. If we could only talk like Jesus talked. No wasted words. Speaking with authority, not like the scribes and the Pharisees. Luke chapter 4, verse 22. And all were speaking well of him, and wondering at the gracious words which were falling from his lips. Why is conversation so important? Because we're ambassadors for the kingdom of Christ. We have a teaching ministry given to us in the Great Commission, Matthew 28, 19, and 20. We're left here to be spokespersons for the King of Kings. So how could we not work on making our conversation perfect? 2 Corinthians 5:20. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, as though God were making an appeal through us. And Ephesians chapter 6, verse 20. For which I'm an ambassador in chains, that in proclaiming it I may speak boldly as I ought to speak. We are speaking in behalf of God. We must realize our high position and calling. So the subject I'm addressing here is how to talk politics, because this is God and Country Radio. But I'm really talking about developing our entire witness. Only a very small part of our witness might be to use a political event or a political thought to help a person come closer to God. But the same principles I'm sharing here will apply to every conversation. The way I would like to approach this is to give you 12 principles or rules for political talk. This is not a complete list. It's just a few things I've learned through the years. I could probably write a list of about 50 principles, but here are 12 just to start off with. And the first rule is don't always talk politics. It's not the venue through which everyone is reached for Christ. You might imagine that everybody is as interested in politics as you are. But that's not true. Polls show that only a third of the population has any interest in politics. And even a smaller percentage can converse on the subject. A recent survey found that only 25% of the public could name all three branches of government. Only 6% of the public could name the Speaker of the House. So we need to start off assuming, when we enter into a conversation, that the person we're talking with is probably not informed on politics. And if you start unloading a bunch of political references, you're going to intimidate the person. On the other hand, it is true that surveys are finding that more people are becoming interested in politics. And it probably has something to do with the 24/7 news cycle and also the social unrest in our times. As the culture war heats up, people are paying more attention to government. Even as people depart from God, they look to government for their salvation. For example, during the French Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution or Germany in the 1930s, I'm sure everyone in those countries were talking politics. So if you're interested in politics these days, you're part of a cultural trend. And we can use this new cultural interest in our evangelism. Now, my technique in this regard is to let other people bring up the subject. Because if the person I'm talking with is the type of person who will be reached through a political discussion, he will be the one who brings up the subject. But those moments are rare. Don't always talk politics. It's not always the venue to jump into with every person. 1 Corinthians 9:22, I have become all things to all men, so that I might by all means save some. Adapt. And number 2, a more substantial point here. Remember that the main reason why our conversation is rejected is the fault of the hearers, even if we are poor communicators. I say this because sometimes we beat ourselves up over our communication failures. But there is a spiritual battle going on here. If we were talking about what people are mostly interested in, sports, entertainment, money, it's amazing how people then overlook speech that's unpolished, gruff, disjointed, incoherent. People's interest in the subject overcomes many faults. And since the world is at enmity with God, people are not very interested in God and His truth. You've heard the old rule: never talk religion and politics. Why is that? Because those subjects bring up the important values of life, values that many people want to suppress. Now, we can understand why many people don't want to talk about religion, because they're running from God. But why is politics so offensive to some people? Because politics is one of the main applications of God's truth. Politics is all about the rightness or the wrongness of certain policies or values. Abortion, LGBT, socialism. So when we talk politics from a godly perspective, we already have an animus against us. We are challenging people's cherished worldviews. And if we are poor in our conversation skills, that will be used against us. It will be their excuse to reject truth, and we don't want to give people that excuse. Jesus said in Luke chapter 10, verse 16, the one who listens to you listens to me, and the one who rejects you rejects me. So let's remember that truth is only popular with those people who are of the truth. John chapter 18, verse 37, everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. I was reading an interview a while back where the great Bible teacher R.C. Sproul was sharing how he came to faith in Christ while he was in college. Sproul was listening to another student explain to a group of students gathered the relevance of the Bible. And this student was explaining Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verse 3. If the clouds are full, they pour out rain upon the earth, and whether a tree falls toward the south or toward the north, wherever the tree falls, there it lies. Now, the way Sproul tells the story, it didn't sound as if the student knew what he was talking about. It kind of sounded as if the student was just trying to show off his knowledge. But R.C. Sproul went away from that encounter thinking, I am a tree that has fallen in the wrong direction. I need to get right with God. Now, that isn't even the meaning of the Ecclesiastes 11 text. But when the Spirit of God works on a person, even the worst presentation of the gospel will bring forth fruit. And that's been my experience in evangelism. When I see people come to Christ, it often happens through the weakest vessel and through the weakest presentation. And besides, who is a perfect witness? God has chosen to use us in our weakness to get the gospel across. If God wanted a perfect witness, he could have had the angels give out the gospel. But he uses us in our weakness. And that reminds us that we don't have to be perfect before we share the truth. And this is probably why the Bible, even though it speaks about the importance of good speech, doesn't emphasize it to an extreme. The burden for the rejection of God's truth is ultimately put upon the hearers who reject God's truth, not the messenger. 1 John 4, they are from the world, therefore they speak as from the world, and the world listens to them. We are from God. He who knows God listens to us. He who is not from God doesn't listen to us. Number 3, we must speak up politically. The evils in our society are serious. To not speak up is to be like those in 1930 Germany who ignored the concentration camps. Proverbs 24:11. Deliver those who are being taken away to death, and those who are staggering to the slaughter. Oh, hold them back. If you say, see, we didn't know this, does he not consider it who weighs the heart? And does he not know it who keeps the soul? And will he not render to man according to his works? An old political lawyer friend who always quotes Alexander Solzhenitsyn, in keeping silent about evil, in burying it so deep within us that no sign of it appears on the surface, we are implanting it, and it will rise up 1,000-fold in the future when we neither punish nor reproach evildoers. We are not simply protecting their trivial old age, we are thereby ripping the foundations of justice from beneath new generations. The reason Russia was lost to atheistic communism was that so few people spoke up against it. And the problem for most people is not a failure to know what to say, but simple cowardice. We're like the dumb dogs who will not bark. In Isaiah 56, we would rather not make any waves so that in the short term we can keep our friends and our job. Augustine, in his book, The City of God, said the following about Christians in Rome in the 4th century. For often we wickedly blind ourselves to the occasions of teaching and admonishing them, the ungodly. Sometimes even of reprimanding and chiding them, either because we shrink from the labor or are ashamed of offending them, or because we fear to lose good friendships, lest this should stand in the way of our advancement, to injure us in some worldly manner or matter, which neither our covetous disposition desires to obtain, or our weakness shrinks from losing. And in this work, The City of God, Augustine actually has a whole section about how Rome fell because Christians were unwilling to speak up. And don't be like those Christians who are offended by other Christians who speak up. They may not be perfect. They may not be the best communicators, but at least they're speaking up. At least they're still excited about truth. They want to change the world for good, and we don't want to ever lose that and fall into complacency. One more thought about this. A friend of mine, and I do have a few friends, made a good point from Proverbs 25:26. Like a trampled spring and a polluted well is a righteous man who gives way before the wicked. So you're listening to someone spout off all sorts of liberal nonsense, and you say nothing. This verse applies to you. You're letting the spring get polluted, and you're giving way to the wicked by not refuting the error. So as a rule of life, don't let people get away with spewing nonsense, either a professor or politician or coworker or family member. You need to correct people. Now, how are you to do that? That brings me to my next point. Number 4, always be brief. Brevity is the soul of wit. Try to figure out how to say the most with the fewest words possible, especially when you're responding to an antagonistic audience. You only have a few seconds to say something that's meaningful, that will refute their position, and will leave them something to remember. And even if you're in a conversation with a friendly audience, people don't remember much of what you have to say. The more you talk, the less is remembered. When people come back to me and thank me for something I have said in the past, and that happens every once in a while, they always repeat one line that I have said to them. And they'll say, that line stuck in my head. So it seems if people are going to remember anything we have to say, it's going to be one line. So we have to make it good. Proverbs chapter 29, verse 11. A fool utters all of his mind, but a wise man keeps it in till afterwards. Ecclesiastes 5:3. A fool's voice is known by the multitude of words. Ecclesiastes 10:14. A fool also is full of words. Proverbs 10:19. Where there are many words, transgression is unavoidable, but he who restrains his lips is wise. And then, of course, James 1:19. But everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. So be brief. We all know that person everyone listens to. That quiet sage in the office who doesn't say much, but when he speaks up, everyone listens. If you are going to turn people off by your political talk, you will likely do it by talking too much. So try not to unload every possible thought in your head about every possible subject. A wise man keeps it until afterwards, because people only learn in little bites. People are naturally proud. They would rather talk than listen. Now, to be brief, it is helpful to know some quotes or some adages. Proverbs 25:11, apples of gold in settings of silver. Quotes like, freedom is not free, or America's salvation is not going to come flying in on Air Force One. Or Franklin's quote, a democracy if you can keep it. Or John Adams' famous quote, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate for the government of any other. Or Augustine, what are kingdoms without justice? They are just gangs of bandits. And I expect you know all the spiritual lessons that are communicated through quotes such as those. And I assume we all know that if you do have some good quotes memorized, don't be like one of those conversationalists who bore his friends with the same quotes over and over again. Better yet, in your discussion, quote a Bible verse. Most people have never heard a Bible verse on a particular social issue. And in being brief, try to boil everything down to the heart of the matter. If you're discussing abortion with a pro-abortion proponent, you might say, well, the bottom line is a child is being murdered. Your opponent may not agree with you, but that's going to stick in his craw. If you're discussing LGBT ideology, you might say, well, the bottom line is whether we think man's natural fleshly desires are to be accepted or to be fought against. See, what you need to do is sum up for your hearers the core issue. Then you're really going to add something to the conversation. If you see the bigger principle in an event, you will amaze your audience. But again, this all needs to be said in just a couple of sentences. Plan what you're going to interject before you speak, and be willing to leave the conversation having said the fewest words. Number 5, don't just work on your technique, work on your motive. In fact, your motives are more important than your technique, because if you have the right motives, you will have good technique. Why do you say what you say? Are you in a conversation just to prove to other people what you know? Are you in a conversation just to vent outrage? Are you simply trying to win the argument? Are you trying to save America out of selfish motives just to save your own hide? Is that why you hate the left? If your motives are impure, it's going to come out in the way you speak. And we all know that classic Bible text in this regard, 1 Corinthians chapter 13. If I speak with the tongue of men and of angels and do not have love, I become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. So if you're not motivated by love, your conversation will be like a noisy gong. A political hothead is a political hothead not simply because he hasn't learned some communication skills, but because he has a lousy attitude. And my experience is that the root problem with many political junkies is anger. Anger at the world. The world doesn't give me what I want. The world doesn't act the way I want it to act. So I'm angry at the world. I'm angry at the freeloaders. I'm angry at the lawlessness. I'm angry at the violation of my rights. I'm angry at the taxes. And yes, Christians should be angry at sin, but not angry because other people are ruining our lives. Christians are instructed in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 9, to not return evil for evil or insult for insult, but give a blessing instead. For you were called for the very purpose that you might inherit a blessing. So if the world is persecuting us, if it's insulting us, we are to repay that with a blessing. Now, most people don't return evil for evil, the evil of the bureaucrats, by going off and blowing up a post office. But they will return evil for evil by being angry at the world. And in that sense, they are returning evil for evil, insult for insult. They have not yet learned that they need to repay the evil of the world with a blessing. So don't be motivated by anger, be motivated by love. We're to speak for the purpose of helping others, caring about individuals. And that brings me to my next point, number 6, edify, build up other people. If what you're saying is not for the purpose of building up others in wisdom and encouragement and godliness, then just don't open your mouth. That's Proverbs chapter 30, verse 32. If you have done foolishly in lifting up yourself, if you have thought evil, lay your hand upon your mouth. The New Testament is filled with this counsel to focus on this old English word to edify, which means to build up. Romans chapter 14, verse 19. So then pursue the things which make for peace and the building up of one another. 1 Corinthians 14, 17. For you are giving thanks well enough, but the other person's not edified. Ephesians 4:29, let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, only such a word as is good for edification according to the need of the moment, so that you will give grace to those who hear. The word charis, a gift. You're giving a gift to people. Or 1 Timothy 1:4, not to pay attention to myths or endless genealogies, which give rise to mere speculation, rather than furthering the administration of God, which is by faith. So rather than talking about nonsense or petty things, say things that will further the kingdom of God. The goal in all of our conversation is either to lead people to Christ, and if they already know him, the goal is to lead them closer to God's truth. Colossians chapter 1, verse 28, we proclaim him, admonishing every man and teaching every man with all wisdom, so that we may present every man complete in Christ. So you ask, how can political conversation edify a person spiritually? You may never have thought of that. You may have only engaged in political talk just to vent. If that's been your only purpose, you need to change. Every event in the news can be a springboard off of which to remind people about the kingdom of Christ, that the will of God needs to be done on earth as it is in heaven, that the sins of our society are what Jesus came to redeem us from. Always bring the conversation back around to Christ and his kingdom. That's what history and news is all about. Number 7, in that edification, the method needs to be patience and kindness. 2 Timothy 2:24 is a text that every Christian needs to commit to memory. The Lord's bondservant must not be quarrelsome, but be kind to all, apt to teach, patient when wronged, with gentleness correcting those who are in opposition, if perhaps God may grant them repentance, leading to the knowledge of the truth. We're to edify or teach by means of gentleness, as opposed to being quarrelsome. The Greek word there means to battle. You're not going to edify people. You're not going to be welcomed if you have an antagonistic, confrontational approach. And as the text says, be kind to all. With gentleness, correct those who oppose the truth. As the old saying goes, you get more bees with honey than with vinegar. Proverbs 16:21, sweetness of speech increases persuasiveness. Being belligerent may please your flesh, but you're not going to win anyone that way, because people are not changed by your anger. They're changed by God's truth. And this is a very common error in communication. And many people think that the objective is to out-yell, out-intimidate, out-muscle other people to win the argument. They think they're so clever, but they don't win anyone. And this is what violent people on their left are doing. Antifa. Unfortunately, they unknowingly are actually undermining their cause by not being kind, by not being gentle, by being evil. People are won by combining truth with kindness and generosity. That creates a cognitive dissonance in the minds of those who oppose God's truth. Because you are the person they may disagree with ideologically, but you're the most happy, the most positive, the most generous, the most encouraging person at your place of work. And if they don't know God, they are going to be miserable. And all of their friends are going to be miserable. Maybe not now, but in the near future, because that is the works of the flesh. But here we're speaking the truth, and we demonstrate it in our manner and in our personal lives, the good fruit of the truth. The proof is in the pudding. I mean, look at the difference between the joy and the happiness and the love at the Right to Life March, as opposed to the vitriol and the anger at the Women's March. And by the way, don't imitate the conservative pundits that you hear on the radio or on television. Their sarcasm, their taunting, their name-calling, that's all entertainment for political hotheads. But when you actually talk to real people, be kind, be gentle. Number 8, similarly, be humble. Philippians chapter 2, verse 3, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind. Ephesians 4:2, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, showing tolerance for one another in love. 1 Peter 5:5, clothe yourself with humility toward one another. And I'm not simply talking about the show of humility, but actually understand that we don't know as much as we think we know. When Christians first get involved in politics, they often jump to hasty conclusions. They often superimpose their wrong theology and their wrong understanding of history on the situation. Every Christian I know who has ever engaged in the political scene, after about 10 years, looks back and sees how they were wrong in much of their thinking. Maybe not on the major issues, but in some of the application. For example, they may have blamed the politicians when later they realize that it's the public's fault. Or they may be emphasizing at one time that we need to get back to the Constitution, only to later realize that the Constitution was not the secret of America's success. They may begin with great anger toward what's going on, but later have that anger mitigated by coming to understand God's purpose for letting evil rule. So be firm in your convictions, but be teachable. Have some humility. And of course, this means listening to your opponent. Try to understand their perspective and appreciate aspects of it, even though it may be wrong. This also means not taking yourself too seriously. have a sense of humor. Number 9, baby steps. This kind of goes along with point number 4, be brief. But don't expect people to change overnight. And don't unload upon people a truckload of truth. Instead, just small bites. Notice how Jesus modeled this for us in his conversations we have recorded in the Gospels. I was recently speaking to a Christian young man, a high school student. He shared with me some things that he had just learned in the news. And I was reminded again how little young people know. They think it's a great revelation to discover that there's two parties, the Democratic and Republican parties, and that there is a left and a right. Those are new terms, and they don't even have them fully defined. So all I could do with this young man is just describe to him and direct him to certain websites and certain books for him to read. He has a long road ahead of him, learning about the kingdom of Christ in this world. Be patient. The goal is not to win everyone to everything in a single day. And in this regard, don't do battle on everything. You know, I find some Christians go off on how grammar has deteriorated or how people's dress has gone downhill or how people are terrible drivers or how people are so lazy today. Don't swing the sword at every error of society that might be tangentially related to America's apostasy. If you do that, you're going to look petty, you're going to look negative. Instead, fight the big giants. Number 10, do some audience analysis. Consider who you're speaking with. Remember, Jesus told us not to throw our pearls before swine. So we may think we need to speak with everybody, but Jesus' words remind us that no, maybe it's better not to share certain truths with certain people until the time is right. So we're to be fishers of men. Think of yourself as being on a fishing expedition. You have various lines in the water with different types of bait at the end of each line. Choose the right bait for the fish you want to catch. And when the fish takes the bait, you let the line out. Then you slowly begin to bring in the fish. And don't fish where people are not biting. Even Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10, only stay in a house that welcomes you. So look for the fish or the sheep who will hear the voice of the great shepherd. Number 11, think in terms of asking questions rather than making direct statements. And this is very important because by asking questions, you let the other person talk and think. By your questions alone, you can lead people to the right conclusions. And these will be conclusions that will stick with them because they came up with the answer. Jesus used questioning all the time to lead his audience to certain conclusions. Whose image is on the coin? Why did David call his son his Lord? What will the owner of the vineyard do to those servants? What will the profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? You can convey an entire lecture in theology just by asking the right questions and listening. Did anyone ask the serpent in the garden any questions? The serpent certainly questioned God, but nobody questioned the serpent. Why does the burden of proof have to be on us? Let the left prove to you why they're right, and their own arguments will refute them. The goal is to first undermine the ideological foundation of the opponent, the things in which they trust. Proverbs chapter 21, verse 22, a wise man scales the city of the mighty and brings down the stronghold in which they trust. And you do this by questioning. And one way to do this is also to cut to the chase. By simply asking people, how do they know they're right? What is their authority? This moves the conversation over to what really matters. Is man the authority, or is God the authority? And that's really the foundation of every discussion. Well, to finish it off, number 12, be positive. I know that these points have overlapped and are somewhat scattered, but being positive deserves an entire point. You may never have seen this before, but that's actually the meaning of 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 20. For as many as are the promises of God, in him they are yes. Therefore also through him is our amen, to the glory of God through us. So Paul is referring here to his ministry as being a positive affirmation of God's promises. People can tell whether you're a negative person or a positive person, whether you're a critic or whether you're a blesser, whether you're a builder or whether you're a destroyer, whether you're a complainer or if you're one who rejoices always, as we're commanded to do in 1 Thessalonians 5:16. So these 12 points are just to get you started in the right direction, to help you develop some godly conversation skills. It will be a lifetime project, but at least realize it is a project. 1 Peter 3:15, making yourself ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. So there it is. Into the archive goes a God and Country program about how to talk politics. Maybe you know someone who needs to hear it. This is a program for all of those obnoxious political hotheads you know, and for all of us who don't want to become one. The contact information is on the closing slide. Don't forget to subscribe, to lend your moral support to the channel. Thank you for making God and Country a part of your discipleship in the Word.